The airport buzzed with its usual rhythm, rolling suitcases on polished floors, coffee cups clinking in hurried hands, announcements echoing through the cavernous terminal. In that steady flow of movement, she passed almost invisibly. A woman, in her mid-30s, dressed neatly but not extravagantly, her brown jacket folded carefully over one arm, her carry-on small and unassuming. She looked like anyone else, an office worker heading to a conference, a mother slipping away for a brief visit, a traveler simply moving from one city to another. To most, she was just another number on the passenger list. Passenger 89. Her boarding pass beeped without issue at the gate, and the attendant gave a polite smile. She offered one in return, though faint, as if her mind was elsewhere. Stepping onto the jet bridge, she inhaled deeply. The familiar smell of pressurized air and the faint tang of jet fuel filled her senses. She had flown many times before, yet this time felt different, though she couldn't have explained why. Some journeys announced their significance only in hindsight. Inside the cabin of Flight 217, the air was alive with its usual small dramas. A businessman argued with overhead bins, cramming his laptop case with exaggerated frustration. A mother soothed a crying toddler with whispered promises of snacks. A teenager with headphones already in place scrolled through his phone, lost in his own world. Everyone carried their own stories, yet none could have imagined that theirs would soon be bound together in a way that defied logic and routine. She walked down the aisle with a steady pace, slipping past rows of strangers, until she reached her assigned seat near the wing. Sliding in, she buckled herself in without hurry, placed her small bag beneath the seat, and settled. Her hands folded in her lap still. Her gaze turned toward the window, where the runway stretched into the haze of a September morning. For a moment, her reflection looked back at her calm, unreadable, perhaps even distant. The engines roared to life, sending a vibration through the cabin. Safety announcements played, though few listened. She did. She always listened. Every detail imprinted itself on her mind. The way the flight attendants demonstrated the oxygen masks, the calm monotone explaining emergency exits. Others dismissed these details, but for her, such things had never been background noise. They were signals reminders that routine could crack without warning. The aircraft lumbered down the runway, gathering speed until gravity surrendered, and the ground fell away. Passenger 89 felt the lift in her stomach, the familiar pull against her chest. She steadied herself with a hand against the armrest, then exhaled slowly as the plane leveled into the climb. The seatbelt sign remained lit as clouds swallowed the view. Passengers fidgeted, adjusted, or sighed. Soon enough, the plane smoothed into altitude. Drinks carts rattled, laughter broke out in pockets, and phones switched into airplane mode reluctantly. She kept silent. Her fingers brushed the window's edge, tapping lightly as her thoughts drifted back through years she rarely revisited. There had been a time when she sat not as a passenger, but as a trainee in a small airfield, headphones clamped over her ears, learning to interpret the clipped cadence of aviation radio. It had been a fleeting pursuit, abandoned when life's path curved elsewhere. Yet the rhythm of those transmissions had etched themselves into her memory, the call signs, the phrases, the clarity demanded even under duress. She had not touched a radio panel in over a decade, but she could still recall the calm voices that steadied chaos. A hum of engines blended with scattered conversations. A man behind her told a story too loudly, forcing his companion to laugh. Politely, across the aisle, a woman scribbled furiously in a notebook. The crew moved gracefully through their routines, pouring coffee, adjusting blankets, answering questions with practiced patience. To anyone watching, Flight 217 was an unremarkable journey through American skies, its cabin a microcosm of ordinary life. But ordinary was a fragile illusion. Somewhere over the Midwest, thin clouds stretched like gauze across the horizon, muting sunlight into pale silver. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, smooth and reassuring. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're at cruising altitude. Weather ahead looks favorable. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the flight." Applause broke out from a small group in the back, though half-hearted, more ritual than response. She closed her eyes briefly, listening not just to his words, but to the cadence. Pilots always carried a certain composure, a steadying rhythm that anchored passengers to calm. Yet deep down, she had always known how fragile that calm could be. As the minutes passed, the plane settled into its rhythm. Trays opened, snacks were distributed, and the mechanical heart of the aircraft drummed faithfully beneath them. Number. One noticed the subtle flicker of one instrument in the cockpit, or the faint static interrupting a radio channel. Not yet. For passenger 89, time stretched differently. She wasn't restless nor distracted. She simply observed the pattern of clouds, the tilt of wings, the subtle tension in the flight attendants' movements as they whispered near the galley. Tiny things most people dismissed, she noted quietly. Not out of paranoia, but habit. Some part of her still carried the instincts of training long set aside, the habit of paying attention when others drifted into comfort. She did not yet know how vital that instinct would become. The plane pressed westward, slicing through open air. Conversations dwindled as passengers retreated into books, headphones, or shallow naps. Children slept on their parents' shoulders. The businessman finally surrendered, storing his laptop with a frustrated sigh. For a brief, fleeting moment, peace draped the cabin. Then, as if the world itself exhaled differently, she felt something change. A low hum stuttered beneath the floor. A barely perceptible flicker ran across the panel near the galley. And though no announcement followed, her pulse quickened. She turned back toward the window, steadying her breath, sensing a shift she could not yet name. No one else noticed. Not yet, but she did. And far ahead, beyond sight, the first threads of tension began to weave threads that would soon bind her voice to military radios, that would carry her calm across cockpits designed for war. For now, she remained passenger 89, just a woman, on a plane, seated quietly near the wing. But destiny, uninvited and relentless, was already climbing into altitude with her. The cabin had settled into a rhythm. A hum of engines, the soft clink of ice and plastic cups, the occasional shuffle of a passenger stretching in narrow aisles. To most, the flight seemed steady, uneventful. But in the cockpit, far from the chatter of the cabin, a ripple of unease had begun. At first, it was subtle, a flicker across the communications panel. The captain reached to adjust the frequency, chalking it up to static interference. Radios often carried bursts of garbled noise, and storms in the Midwest sometimes bent signals in strange ways. But the second officer frowned when another channel fell silent, and then another. The captain's reassuring tone gave way to a clipped edge as he tried again. "Kansas City Center. This is Flight 217. Radio check." Silence answered. The hum of the aircraft suddenly felt heavier. In the cabin, no one noticed. Flight attendants poured coffee, passengers paged through magazines, and children whispered games. Only passenger 89, sitting near the wing, sensed something. She had been watching the subtle exchanges between crew, noting how their smiles faltered when they passed messages. She knew that kind of silence, the pause where professionals tried to mask uncertainty from those who depended on them. When the oxygen masks dropped moments later, all illusions shattered. It began with a sudden jolt, turbulence that rattled trays and knocked cups to the floor. A baby wailed, startled by the violent shake. Passengers gasped as the plane shuddered through uneven air. Then, with a hiss like a snake waking, Yellow masks spilled from overhead compartments, dangling above stunned faces. Panic erupted. "Put them on. Quickly." Attendants shouted, voices straining against fear. Hands clawed at dangling tubes. Children cried. Some passengers froze, staring as though paralyzed, while others yanked masks over their mouths with trembling fingers. The businessman behind passenger 89 cursed under his breath, fumbling with straps. She slipped hers on with steady hands, then reached over to help the panicked woman beside her, tightening the elastic gently, nodding with quiet assurance. Her calm spread in small ripples. Up front, the pilots wrestled with alarm screaming. Across their panels, altitude fluctuated, warnings flashed, and their radios remained stubbornly mute. Without communication, they were flying blind to controllers, their flight suddenly invisible, unresponsive, a potential threat in skies that still carried scars from recent history. The captain's jaw tightened. He had flown through storms, engine failures, and near misses, but this was different. He felt cut off, adrift in hostile silence. The first officer muttered, "Backup's dead too. Nothing's transmitting." The captain swore softly, glancing back toward the door. "We need another solution." In the cabin, fear spread like fire. Passengers screamed questions no one could answer. A man prayed loudly in the aisle. One flight attendant tried to steady them, forcing a calm smile while her own hands shook. But amid the chaos, passenger 89 remained still. She had seen enough training rooms, enough aviation manuals, to know what silence in the cockpit meant. Without communication, a flight became not just vulnerable, it became suspicious. And in American skies, suspicion carried its own dangers. She unbuckled her seatbelt. "Ma'am, please stay seated," a flight attendant urged, rushing toward her. Passenger 89 met her eyes with quiet conviction. "Take me to the cockpit." "Now," the attendant blinked, startled. "You can't?" "I know what to do," she interrupted firmly. There was no desperation in her voice, only authority. Something about the steadiness of her tone broke through the attendant's panic. She hesitated, then glanced toward the cockpit door, where muffled alarms still screamed. In her gut, she knew normal rules no longer applied. She nodded once, "Follow me." As they pushed forward, passengers stared, whispering. A few shouted protests, fearing she might be part of the danger. But her calm stride silenced them more effectively than words. The crew keyed in the access code, and the reinforced door cracked open. She stepped inside, and in that instant, the roles shifted. She was no longer simply passenger 89. She was a voice stepping into the silence. The cockpit was a storm of flashing lights and strained voices. The captain barked orders. The first officer toggled switches, but nothing restored the radios. When she entered, they barely noticed her at first. But when she slid into the jump seat, fastening herself with practiced ease, their eyes snapped to her. "Who are you?" the captain demanded, sweat beading on his forehead. "Someone who knows what dead radios mean," she said evenly. Her hands moved instinctively across the secondary panel, flipping protective covers, checking dials. "Let me try." The first officer opened his mouth to protest, then paused as he watched her fingers. They didn't fumble. They didn't search. They moved with memory. The captain hesitated, then nodded. "Do it." She adjusted knobs, pressed transmit, and spoke into the microphone with crisp clarity. Her voice, calm and unwavering, cut through the static. "This is Flight 217. We have lost primary communication. Passenger transmitting." For a heartbeat, there was nothing but the hiss of dead air. Her stomach tightened, but she didn't falter. She tried again, steady as stone. "Flight 217. Communication systems failure. Do you copy?" This time, a burst of static cracked, and then a voice broke through, incredulous. Flight 217? Repeat? Who is this? Relief flickered across her face. She leaned closer, her tone sharp with discipline. This is a passenger, relaying. For the crew, we've lost all standard comms. Flight 217 is secure, requesting assistance. The ground controllers went silent, stunned that a passenger, not a pilot, spoke. Then, almost tripping over their words, they fired questions. She answered calmly, relaying between crew and ground, becoming the bridge no one expected. The captain stared at her, disbelief mixing with gratitude. For the first time since the radios failed, hope returned to the cockpit. But outside the narrow windows, the sky held another danger. On military radars, Flight 217's silence had already raised alarms. And at a nearby base, two A-10 Warthogs had just lifted into the air, their engines roaring toward the unresponsive jet, slicing across American skies. Passenger 89 didn't know it yet, but her voice would soon have to reach not just controllers, but pilots trained for war. The cockpit was chaos. Warning lights flashed red, alarms shrieked in shrill tones, and the air itself seemed charged with panic. The captain's hands moved across panels, like a pianist striking the wrong keys again and again, desperate to find a sequence that would bring silence and order. The first officer's jaw was clenched, his shirt damp with sweat as he wrestled with stubborn instruments. They were seasoned men, trained to handle crises, yet their tools had betrayed them. And then she entered. Passenger 89 slipped into the jump seat as though she belonged there, her body steady even as the aircraft jolted from turbulence. For a heartbeat, the pilots stared at her as if she were an apparition. No passenger belonged here. No passenger. Should have known how to even fasten that seat's harness. But her hands moved quickly, efficiently, locking herself in with muscle memory, not curiosity. The captain snapped, "Who are you?" "This is restricted." Her voice, calm and precise, cut through the alarms. "I know what's happening. Radios are dead. Let me help." The first officer bristled. "You can't just," she turned, locking eyes with him. "You're flying blind to ground control. If we stay silent, you'll have fighters scrambling in minutes." That landed. Like a hammer blow. Both men froze. She wasn't guessing. She knew. The captain hesitated, then gestured sharply. "Fine, but you don't touch flight controls. Only comms. Understood." Her fingers danced across the secondary panel. She checked the transponder dark. She switched to the emergency frequency. Nothing. Static hissed back at her like mockery. The dead weight of silence pressed into her chest, but she did not falter. Training, she thought, long buried, clawed its way back, and her mind sharpened. She pressed transmit again, her voice clipped and professional. "Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is Flight 217, passenger transmission. We've lost primary comms. Do you copy?" For 5 long seconds, there was nothing, just static. The pilots exchanged a look of despair, as though this last attempt was another cruel failure. But she leaned in again, adjusting dials with deft hands, and repeated, "This is civilian Flight 217, passenger transmission. Communication systems are down. Crew is intact. Requesting response." The speaker crackled, faint at first, then a burst of life. "Flight 217? Confirm, did you say passenger transmitting?" Her lips tightened, but her voice stayed steady. "Affirmative. I am relaying for the crew. Flight 217 is secure. We require assistance." A first officer sagged back, stunned. The captain blinked, then let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "Well, I'll be damned." On the ground, confusion rippled across control rooms. A passenger speaking for an aircraft? It sounded impossible, reckless. Yet her tone carried authority, the cadence of someone who had trained for this. She relayed beta altitude, heading, fuel estimates, her words precise, never wavering. Controllers adjusted their plans, voices now sharp with urgency, recognizing the gravity of the situation. For the first time since the alarms began, the cockpit felt anchored. The captain leaned toward her, his voice low, almost incredulous. "Where did you learn that?" "Years ago. Aviation radio training. It never really leaves you." He studied her face, as though searching for cracks. There were none, only focus. While she transmitted, the cabin behind the reinforced door descended into turbulence of another kind. Passengers murmured, frightened, sensing the abnormal silence from the cockpit. Rumors bloomed like wildfire. The plane was hijacked, the pilots incapacitated, something worse. Flight attendants tried to soothe them, but whispers grew louder. Some swore they had seen her escorted forward and feared the worst. But inside, she kept her eyes locked on the dials, voice cutting through static like a lifeline. "Denver Center, this is Flight 217. Do you copy?" "We copy. 217. Pin the firm reply now. We see your transponder is dark. Are you in distress?" "Affirmative. Electrical failure affecting radios and nav. Crew is maintaining control. No hostile activity. Requesting guidance." Controllers relayed instructions, their confidence returning with her voice, bridging the gap. She repeated every word calmly, translating for the pilots, her presence binding the fractured chain of communication. For a fleeting moment, relief began to seep in. Systems still faltered, but they were no longer alone. Then a new voice cut. Across the channel, firmer, colder. "Flight 217, be advised. 2 military aircraft have been scrambled to intercept. Maintain course and altitude. Do not deviate." The cockpit fell silent. The captain's knuckles whitened on the yoke. The first officer muttered, "Damn it. They think we're a rogue bird." Her chest tightened. She had known it was coming. Silence in the skies could mean only one thing to defense radars: threat. And threats were neutralized. Her hand tightened on the mic. She could almost feel the pilot's hesitation pressing against her back. The next words mattered more than awe. "Anything." She drew a breath and spoke with measured strength. "Military intercept. This is civilian Flight 217. Repeat, civilian. We have communications failure, not hostile intent. Do not engage." Her voice carried into the void. The cockpit held stillness like glass, waiting for the answer. None came, only the low growl of engines and the endless hiss of static. The captain muttered under his breath, "God help us." Passenger 89 did not flinch. She leaned forward, her eyes hard, her voice unshaken. She knew this was only the beginning. Far away, 2 A-10 warthogs banked through the atmosphere, their cannons glinting in the fading sun, their orders clear. And soon, their pilots would hear the voice of a woman who refused to break in the face of silence. Far below, radar screens told a story more terrifying than any passenger could imagine. Flight 217 had gone silent. Its transponder was dead, its radios mute, and to the eyes of air defense, it looked no different from a hijacked ghost ship wandering through protected airspace. Controllers exchanged sharp words across consoles, voices growing sharper with each unanswered call. Still no response from 217, one demanded. Negative. Passenger voice earlier, but nothing consistent. Signals unstable. Scramble. Them. The order left no room for debate. Within minutes, alarms blared across a nearby base. Pilots sprinted across tarmac, boots striking pavement as mechanics pulled away ladders. Twin A-10 warthogs roared to life, their engines shaking. The ground. Painted in gray, blunt and menacing, they were aircraft designed for destruction. Their nose cannons capable of tearing through steel. This wasn't a warning flight, it was an insurance policy. As the fighters clawed into the sky, their mission was simple: identify, escort if safe, destroy if not. High above, inside the civilian jet, passengers sensed nothing yet of the thunder approaching. They remained cocooned in their fragile world of whispered fears and desperate reassurances. Some clutched armrests so tightly their knuckles blanched. Others prayed into trembling hands. The toddler who had cried earlier now slept fitfully on. His mother's lap, oblivious to the currents of dread gathering beyond the windows. Passenger 89 remained in the cockpit, headset pressed firmly over her ears. The captain and first officer both looked to her now as though she were an unofficial third member of the crew. Their confidence in her had grown quickly, born from necessity. She relayed their words with precision, translating chaos into calm. But her voice could not erase the growing edge in the controller's tone. Flight 217, maintain current heading. Do not deviate. Be advised military intercept inbound. Her stomach tightened at those words, but her tone never wavered. Copy. Civilian aircraft Flight 217 will maintain heading and altitude. Negative hostile intent. She emphasized the word civilian and negative hostile intent. They needed to reach ears beyond the control room ears that would soon be inside the cockpits of heavily armed interceptors. The captain's voice was low, grim. They're coming. She nodded once. Then we'll make sure they know exactly who we are. In the cabin, flight attendants did their best to project calm, but the ripple of unease spread faster than reassurance. Passengers. Whispered theories, voices rising, fear sharpening every word. Some swore they had seen armed guards rush into the cockpit before takeoff. Others whispered about bombs, hijackers, or sabotage. The businessman who had been so impatient earlier now sat rigid, eyes darting toward the cockpit door as though it might burst open with revelation. One attendant paused at the cockpit door, whispering, "They're asking what's happening." The captain glanced back. "Tell them nothing they don't need to know." Passenger 89 turned her head slightly. "Tell them this. The situation is being handled." "And it is." The attendant nodded, grateful for the steadiness in her tone, and slipped back into the maelstrom of frightened faces. In the cockpit, time stretched like taut wire. Every second of silence felt longer, heavier. She continued her transmissions, steady, controlled, repeating identification. Each word was a lifeline cast into the void, hoping the right ears would catch it. Flight 217. Civilian aircraft. Experiencing full comms failure. Passenger transmitting. No hostile intent. Over and over, she repeated the mantra, like a beacon pulsing in the storm. And then, faintly, another voice crackled through. Not from controllers, not from ground. A clipped, colder tone. Unidentified aircraft. This is Viper 1. State your status. The cockpit froze. That was no civilian call sign. That was military. Her pulse quickened, but she pressed the mic. Viper 1, this is civilian flight 217. We are in distress. Repeat, distress. No hostile intent. Communication systems failure. There was a pause, the kind that felt like judgment measured in silence. Finally, the voice returned. Copy, 217. Stand by. The captain exhaled sharply, gripping the yoke tighter. The first officer whispered, "They've got eyes on us." And still, outside the windows, there was nothing but empty sky and rolling clouds. The interceptors were there, invisible for now, climbing closer. The knowledge gnawed. At every breath in the cockpit, Passenger 89 kept her voice level. even as her heart drummed. Flight 217, maintaining heading and altitude as instructed. Request visual confirmation when in range. Another pause. Will confirm shortly. Inside the cabin, passengers began to notice the change. The aircraft dipped slightly, correcting its course. Through narrow windows, some swore they saw shadows against the clouds. A murmur spread, panic rising again. The businessman stood abruptly, trying to peer past rows, muttering, "Something's out there." Flight attendants forced him back into his seat, but the seed of dread had sprouted. In the cockpit, tension thickened. Every second stretched. Then the first officer leaned forward suddenly, pointing. There. Out of the haze, a silhouette emerged gray, angular, wings like blades slicing the air. One A-10 Warthog slipped into formation, its armored fuselage glinting in the sunlight. A moment later, its twin appeared on the opposite side, racketing the civilian jet in a silent show of force. The cabin erupted in gasps and shouts. Faces pressed to windows. Fear crackled through the air like electricity. Mothers clutched children tighter. The word fighters whispered across rows, passing like a contagion. But in the cockpit, she leaned into her mic, her voice steady, deliberate. Viper 1, visual confirmed. Civilian aircraft, Flight 217. Request escort. Negative hostile. Intent. The reply came, clipped but softer now. Copy. 217. Hold course. We're with you. The captain let out a long breath. Relief flickered across his eyes, though wariness remained. They believe you, he murmured. Her gaze stayed fixed on the gray shapes outside, flying close, their cannons pointed ahead, but their presence undeniable. They needed a voice they could trust, she said quietly. So we gave them one. For the first time since the nightmare began, hope threaded its way back into the cockpit. Yet it was fragile, delicate, easily shattered. For though the A-10s now flew as guardians, one wrong move, one misinterpreted signal, could still turn them into executioners. Passenger 89 knew it. The pilots knew it. Even the fighters circling outside knew it. And so, as the civilian jet pressed westward under watchful eyes, her voice remained its shield, the only barrier between hundreds of innocent souls and the roar of war. At first, the sight was a whisper, a flicker of gray steel outside the narrow oval windows, a shimmer in the haze. Then it became undeniable. Two armored war machines flanking the civilian jet. Passengers gasped, faces pressed to glass, words tumbling out in fragments. Oh my God. They've sent fighters. Are we under attack? The cabin erupted in fear. Mothers shielded their children's eyes. A man shouted for answers, demanding to know why the military circled them. The businessman, who had already unraveled earlier, now trembled visibly, muttering that something was terribly wrong. Flight attendants rushed down aisles, hands raised, voices straining to calm the storm, but their own fear cracked through their tones. Inside the cockpit, the view was clearer, harsher. On the left wingtip, the broad, blunt shape of an A-10 Warthog hovered in formation. Its nose cannon pointed forward, its engines vibrating the air with low menace. On the right, its twin matched every movement, steady and unyielding. The civilian aircraft was no longer just flying, it was under escort. Passenger 89 inhaled slowly, forcing her pulse into rhythm. She had known this was coming, but knowing did little to quiet the chill in her spine. This was no exercise. These were not trainers or unarmed escorts. These were combat aircraft whose orders, if given, could turn their passenger jet into wreckage in seconds. The captain's knuckles whitened on the yoke. Damn it. If they don't believe us, they will, she interrupted firmly. The first officer turned to her, his voice hoarse. How can you be so sure? She adjusted the mic, her eyes locked on the gray beast flying beside them. Because I'm not going to give them a reason to doubt. Static crackled. Then, the clipped military tone returned. Flight 217. This is Viper 1. You are in restricted airspace and unresponsive to standard hails. State intentions immediately. Her grip tightened on the mic. She kept her voice calm, steady, unmistakably authoritative. Viper 1, this is civilian flight 217. We are experiencing total communications failure. This is a passenger relaying. The crew is intact. Repeat, crew intact. No hostile intent. Request escort to Denver. A pause followed, long enough that every soul in the cockpit seemed to hold breath. Outside, the A-10 held formation, its pilot invisible behind a dark visor. Finally, the reply came. Copy, 217. Passenger relaying? Affirmative, she said crisply. This is passenger 89 transmitting. I have aviation radio training. Crew cannot restore comms. I am bridge. Repeat, no hostile intent. Civilian only. Another silence. Then a different voice cut in. Calmer, but curious. Passenger 89, this is Viper 2. Say again, you're a passenger? Yes, Viper 2. Civilian passenger. Transmitting to maintain communication. The radio hissed faintly. And then, to everyone's surprise, the hardened voice softened, if only by a fraction. You've got nerves of steel, 89. We read you loud and clear. The captain glanced at her, his lips parting in astonishment. The first officer let out a shaky laugh of disbelief. The fighters believed her. Inside the cabin, panic still brewed. Passengers pointed at the warthogs, some crying, others frozen. In silence, the flight attendants whispered hurried explanations, but nothing soothed the sight of combat aircraft shadowing their plane. Finally, one attendant slipped into the cockpit again, eyes wide. They're asking what's happening. They're terrified. Passenger 89 turned slightly, still holding the mic. Tell them this. The fighters are here to protect us, not harm us. Tell them they'll get us home. The attendant blinked at her, almost startled by the certainty in her tone, and nodded and hurried back. Slowly, whispers of reassurance began to ripple through the aisles, fragile but real. Meanwhile, she refocused on the radio. Viper 1, Viper 2, this is Flight 217. Confirm escort to Denver? The reply came firm. Affirmative, 217. We'll ride with you. Maintain heading. No deviations. We've got your back. A weight lifted, subtle but powerful. The captain closed his eyes briefly, relief etched across his face. The first officer muttered, They've shifted. They're not hunting us anymore. They're guarding us. Passenger 89 allowed herself a small exhale. The tide had turned, though barely. The warthogs remained close, their presence a reminder of how thin the line was between protection and destruction. One wrong move could still change everything. But she kept speaking, her voice a lifeline woven into the storm. Copy, Viper 1, will maintain heading. Thank you for escort. The A-10 pilot's response carried something unexpected, a trace of respect. Roger that, 89. You sound like you've done this before. Her lips curved faintly, though her eyes stayed locked on the panel. Once, a long time ago. But not like this. Silence followed, but not hostile silence. Companion silence. The kind that spoke of shared understanding between people who lived by voices over radios, by trust built in words. Back in the cabin, the atmosphere shifted slowly. Fear remained. How could it not? But all crept in too. Passengers watched the gray war machines outside, their cannons glinting, and whispered not just of danger, but of salvation. The fighters had not fired. They flew beside them, steady, unflinching, and through the reinforced door, unseen by most. One passenger's voice had made it so. The captain finally spoke, his tone softer than before. "You saved us. You're still saving us." She shook her head. "We're not there yet, not until wheels touch ground." Yet she felt it too, the shift. The fighters no longer circled as predators. They flew as guardians. And the bridge between fear and protection was her voice, clear and steady across the radio. Hours still stretched ahead. Challenges remained. But for the first time since the silence began, hope settled into the cockpit, fragile but undeniable. Outside, the warthogs held their vigil, wings gleaming in fading light. And when the pilot of Viper 2 dipped his wing ever so slightly, a silent acknowledgement, a warrior's salute, she allowed herself the smallest smile, not for herself, but for the truth taking shape around her. The passengers were no longer prey. They were protected. The first hour under escort passed like a lifetime. Inside the cabin, panic dulled into stunned quiet, though fear still lingered beneath the surface. Children whimpered against mothers' shoulders. Passengers stared through windows at the gray. Silhouettes keeping pace outside. The fighters' presence was undeniable, their blunt noses and armored bellies a reminder of how close destruction had come. Flight attendants moved with hushed efficiency, pouring water into plastic cups, coaxing passengers to drink, reminding them to breathe. The businessman who had nearly collapsed earlier now sat silent, eyes fixed on the warthog pacing beyond. The glass. His lips moved silently, perhaps in prayer. In the cockpit, the air felt thinner, stretched taut between relief and dread. The captain flew steady, his hands rigid on the yoke. The first officer monitored what systems still functioned. Passenger 89 sat between them, headset pressed to her ears, her body a conduit between a grounded world and the fragile vessel she rode. Flight 217. Maintain current heading. Viper 1 said calmly over the radio. She responded instantly. Copy, Viper 1. Heading confirmed. The dialogue repeated in cycles, sterile but grounding. Each call and response reinforced the fragile bond holding their world together. She could not falter. If her voice wavered, so would trust. But as the minutes bled into hours, fatigue pressed heavier against her ribs. The headset pinched, her throat ached from controlled tone, her hands trembled when she lowered them briefly from the mic. She masked it well. The captain and first officer noticed only the steel of her words, never the weight behind them. A lull passed, filled only by static. Then Viper 2's voice crackled through, softer than before. Passenger 89, how are you holding up? The question startled her. For hours, their exchanges had been pure procedure, sterile, clipped, necessary. This was different, human. She hesitated, then allowed herself honesty wrapped in steadiness. Holding, focused. The fighter pilot's chuckle was faint, barely audible. Could have fooled me. Sound like you've been doing this all your life. Her lips twitched, though her eyes stayed fixed on the altimeter. Not my life. Just long enough to know words can carry weight. Roger that, Viper 2 said, tone thoughtful. The captain glanced at her, curious, but asked nothing. He had seen enough to understand that her voice carried more than training. It carried history. As the jet pushed westward, dusk unfurled across the sky. Shadows lengthened, clouds blushed orange and gold. The fighters shimmered in the fading light, their metal skins glowing as if carved from the sun itself. Some passengers gasped softly at the sight, beauty woven into fear. Others closed their eyes, unable to reconcile the serenity outside with the storm in their hearts. Passenger 89 kept her gaze forward, but in her mind, fragments surfaced. Years ago, a summer at a small municipal airfield, a crackling radio in her hands as she shadowed an instructor. "Breathe steady, speak steady," he'd told her. "Air doesn't forgive panic." She had laughed then, never imagining those lessons would echo in a moment like this. "Passenger 89, Viper 1 called, steady as stone. Update ground. Escort remains intact, continuing west. Ada Denver 90 minutes." She relayed flawlessly, her voice flowing like water. The captain whispered under his breath, "I still can't believe this. A passenger saving an airliner." She did not answer. She could not let herself think in those terms. Not savior, not hero. Only bridge, only voice. Back in the cabin, the mood shifted subtly. A child pointed at the fighter outside and whispered, "Is that our protector?" His mother nodded quickly, seizing the word. Protector. It spread quietly through the rows, whispered from mouth to mouth. Protector, not executioner. Not threat. Protector. Flight attendants clung to it, repeating it softly. "They're here. To protect us." The word changed everything. Fear loosened its grip, not vanishing, but easing just enough for breath to return. Passengers sipped water, leaned back against seats. The businessman finally exhaled, eyes closing for the first time in hours. The atmosphere was still fragile, still trembling at the edges, but for the first time, it was survivable. Passenger 89 felt the change too, though she remained anchored in her role. Her voice carried over the radio, even as her mind whispered. Questions she dared not voice aloud. Would the escort truly last until landing? Would the fighters stay their hand if suspicion flickered again? Viper 2's voice broke the silence once more. "You've got quite the calm. 89. Half my recruits would crack under this kind of pressure." She replied evenly, though a trace of dry humor slipped in. "Maybe they haven't had to explain to 200 people why cannons are pointed at them." A low laugh buzzed back through static. "Fair enough." The exchange was brief, but it carried weight. In that moment, respect flowed not just between jet and escort, but between individuals, each acknowledging the other's burden. The A-10 pilots had seen war zones. They had carried out missions few civilians could imagine. Yet here was a passenger, untrained for this scale, holding her ground in the crucible of fear. The sky darkened further, stars beginning to pierce. The horizon. Lights flickered in the cabin, casting rows of weary faces in soft glow. Some passengers dozed fitfully, exhaustion finally winning. Others sat wide-eyed, unable to yield to sleep, while fighters kept their silent vigil. Inside the cockpit, the captain finally allowed himself a small breath. "If we make it down in Denver." His voice trailed off. "We will," she said, firmly. The first officer studied her profile. "How do you keep so certain?" Her eyes stayed on the instruments, her voice even. "Because certainty is all that stands between us and panic. Panic kills faster than fire." Neither pilot argued. They understood too well. The radio crackled again. "Viper 1. Denver approach preparing corridor. We'll hand you off in 40 minutes. Stay steady, 89. "Copy, Viper 1, she answered, tone unshaken. Her throat ached. Her body trembled beneath stillness. But her voice remained, clear and unwavering, carrying hundreds of lives across the night. The A-10s flew on, their engines a low thunder, guardians in steel wings. And as the cabin dozed in uneasy trust, and the pilots clung to their instruments, only passenger 89's voice stood between silence and salvation. Denver's lights began to twinkle faintly through the thickening haze. To the casual observer, they were ordinary city lights, glittering peacefully in the dark. But to those aboard Flight 217, they were distant beacons of hope, tenuous promises. That survival was within reach. For hours, The jet had crossed states under the silent scrutiny of A-10 warhogs, the cockpit alive with tension, the cabin simmering between fear and fragile trust. Passenger 89 pressed the headset closer to her ear. Each word she spoke had to be perfect, measured, precise. Any lapse could cost hundreds of lives. She relayed instructions to the crew, translated air traffic controls' clipped codes, and repeated messages to the fighter pilots. Her voice was a lifeline, threading through static and uncertainty, holding the flight together. Flight 217. Maintain heading. Begin descent corridor in 10 minutes. Viper 1's voice crackled over the radio. She repeated the message immediately to the captain. Heading confirmed. Prepare for descent. The captain's jaw tightened. Brace yourself. This is the critical phase. She nodded, though the words themselves were a comfort. We'll be ready. In the cabin, whispers grew as passengers peered out at faint lights on the horizon. Some murmured prayers, others clutched hands, and the children shifted against tired parents. Flight attendants moved swiftly, reminding people to remain seated, to secure seatbelts, to breathe. Fear still lingered, but hope began to edge it out, fragile and tentative. Passenger 89 felt the weight of it all pressing down. Hours of vigilance, continuous transmission, guiding the aircraft, commanding respect without authority. It was exhausting. Her throat burned from speaking, her back ached from remaining upright, but she did not falter. She could not. The flight depended on her steadiness. Denver Tower, Flight 217, Passenger 89 transmitting. We are descending under escort, requesting clearance to final approach. Crew intact, civilian aircraft. Repeat, civilian. The crackling voice of the controller responded quickly, tension evident despite professional calm. Copy, Flight 217. Runway 35L prepared. Fire trucks and emergency crews standing by. Proceed with caution. You are cleared for approach under escort. Her voice carried back the confirmation, unwavering. Copy, Tower. Clearance received. Proceeding to 35 lighters under escort. Outside, the A-10s adjusted their formation slightly, thinning the escort to allow the civilian plane room for maneuver. Their presence remained constant, watchful, unwavering. Passengers pressed closer to windows, seeing the massive gray silhouettes framing their fragile craft, realizing for the first time that those guns had not fired, that these warriors had kept them alive simply by watching. The captain began the descent, adjustment smooth but deliberate. The first officer read altimeter and instruments with steady hands, both pilots clearly aware that even minor miscalculations at this phase could be catastrophic. Turbulence rattled the plane as Denver's winds met the wings, clouds tossing the jet in gentle but insistent jolts. The cabin felt every shift. Passenger 89 kept speaking, her voice a metronome guiding the cockpit through these last critical moments. Reduce speed gradually. Confirm flaps. Maintain heading. Watch vertical speed. Clearance for final approach confirmed. Tower acknowledging escort. Static interrupted briefly, but she repeated, precise and steady. Every word, every pause, had to reinforce trust. The fighter pilots responded, clipped, careful, but respectful now. She had earned their belief. A civilian, yet the authority in her tone demanded obedience, not by rank, but by necessity. In the cabin, a hush settled over the rows of passengers. Their bodies mirrored the jet's motion, leaning slightly with turns, pressing gently against seatbacks, hands intertwined. Some whispered reassurances to children, others clutched loose belongings, unable to sit fully still. Fear and hope merged into taut awareness. Every pair of eyes tracked shadows outside, every ear strained for the reassuring hum of engines. The city grew closer. The faint grid of streets, the glow of streetlights, the flashes of emergency vehicles lining the runway. Fire trucks and ambulances gleamed in red and yellow, ready, waiting. The anticipation was tangible. The passengers felt it, the crew felt it, and even the A-10 pilots, tense silhouettes in formation, seemed to lean slightly into their guardian role. Passenger 89. Viper 2's voice crackled over the radio. You've done more than I thought possible. We've escorted many aircraft, but I've never seen a passenger manage this. Respect. Her voice remained calm, but the faintest curve of her lips betrayed acknowledgement. Thank you, Viper 2. We're not there yet. The captain nodded. Toward her, grim but approving. She's right. Not until we touched down safely. Flaps were extended gradually. Gear deployed. The plane groaned slightly as the landing mechanisms locked in place. Each movement had to be precise. Misalignment could result in catastrophe. She repeated instructions clearly, concisely, translating and confirming every maneuver. The cockpit became a choreography of life-saving precision, with her voice as the silent conductor. Down in the cabin, the passengers sensed the aircraft's slow alignment with the runway. Hearts pounded collectively. Some clasped hands in silent prayer. Others held the seat in front of them tightly, gripping metal armrests. A mother whispered to her child, "We're going to make it. Keep your eyes open." The jet's descent brought turbulence, sudden gusts that tilted wings. Passenger 89's hands tightened briefly on the mic, but her tone remained steady. Hold heading. Maintain glide slope. Speed stable. Watch instruments. Fire trucks visible. Prepare for touchdown. The fighter pilots mirrored their movements, signaling through formation, keeping close but giving space. The synchronized hum of engines, the low rumble vibrating the fuselage, and her voice interlacing with it created a tense but steady rhythm. It was a ballet of survival. Seconds stretched like minutes. The runway approached, lights now sharp and clear. Emergency crews glimmered in the night, prepared, alert but waiting. No one moved prematurely. Every passenger and crew member was suspended in a fragile state, balanced between hope and terror. She relayed the final instructions. Gear confirmed. Flaps full. Speed reduced. Begin flare for landing. Touchdown imminent. The captain followed her cadence perfectly, the A-10. First officer monitoring descent meticulously. The fighters flanked the jet one last time, protective wings a living shield. The cabin felt the subtle shift gravity pressing more, anticipation coiling tight, hearts racing in synchrony with the aircraft's slow glide. Each passenger realized that the crisis was nearing its peak, that the moment of landing would determine everything. Passenger 89's voice carried across the intercom one final time. Stay calm. Brace. Wheels touching runway in moments. You are safe. We are almost there. Outside, the runway lights blazed beneath them, fire trucks and emergency vehicles lining the path like guardians of the earth. The A-10 signaled their final acknowledgement and began to peel off, maintaining altitude, letting the civilian jet claim the ground alone, still ready to respond if danger appeared. Inside, the cabin braced collectively. Some whispered thanks. Others gasped, all aware of the razor-thin margin separating them from disaster. Passenger 89 pressed her lips together, her heartbeat steady but loud in her chest. She remained the calm eye of a storm that had spanned hours. And now, the final act loomed, the landing itself. The runway approached. The lights grew brighter. Engines hummed with tension. And in her mind, one thought remained clear. Not panic, not fear, but focus. Flight 217 touching down, she whispered softly, though the pilots could hear her clearly. Steady, steady, steady. The runway lights approached in a solid stream, glowing like veins of gold through the darkness. Passenger 89's voice was steady, unwavering, threading calm through the cockpit one final time. Every passenger, every crew member, every emergency responder on the ground waited in tense anticipation. The city's lights blurred below, stars overhead piercing the night sky. One miscalculation, one abrupt gust, one missed signal, and the long nightmare could end in disaster. Maintain glide slope. Confirm touchdown speed, she said softly, almost to herself. The captain's hands moved with absolute precision, every adjustment smooth, calculated. The first officer monitored instruments like a hawk, guiding the flaps, the gear, the final alignment. Her words were metronomic, steady, a rhythm to follow, and the jet responded with obedience born of experience. Down in the cabin, whispers of hope turned to taut anticipation. Passengers clutched armrests, some praying silently, others holding children tighter, watching the runway through narrow windows. Flight attendants murmured reassurances, soft and urgent. The tension was palpable, a collective heartbeat stretching across the fuselage. Viper 1's voice came through the radio, calm but watchful. Passenger 89, final approach confirmed. You're clear to land. Wheels touch, remain steady. We'll continue monitoring. She responded crisply. Copy, Viper 1, stabilized. Final flare in progress. A jet dipped closer, the low roar of engines mingling with the wind over the fuselage. The flaps fully extended, catching the air with precision. The runway grew larger with every second, lines of glowing lights guiding the descent like a path through a storm. A shiver of fear shot through the passengers. Mothers clutched children. Some gripped the seat in front of them as if it were a nod. Anchor. The businessman who had been silent for hours whispered a prayer under his breath. Every passenger felt the weight of the moment. Survival balanced on the skill of 3 individuals and one calm voice. Steady, steady, steady. Passenger 89 repeated, each word measured, perfectly timed. The captain responded with a soft affirmation, adjusting throttle and rudder. The first officer monitored instruments, cross-checking altitude and speed, every fraction of a second critical. Outside, the A-10s maintained formation above, then slowly began to peel away, their guardianship still close, but shifting responsibility to the jet itself. Then the moment came. Wheels touched the runway with a solid thud, the shock absorbed by the landing gear, vibrations running up the fuselage. Relief began to ripple through the cabin. Passengers gasped collectively, some exhaling tears they hadn't realized were held back. Mothers whispered comfort to children. Hands unclenched, shoulders sagged. Touchdown confirmed, she said quietly, though the words carried the weight of a command. Brakes applied. Taxi to runway end. Maintain calm. The jet rolled down the runway, guided by instruments and the pilot's steady hands, flanked by fire trucks and emergency crews. Flashing lights lit the tarmac as teams stood ready, though their presence was precaution, not intervention. The tension of the previous hours slowly unspooled. Finally, the aircraft slowed to a complete stop. Engines idling, flaps retracting. The cabin remained quiet, a moment suspended between disbelief and exhilaration. Then, as though collectively, remembering breath, passengers began to move. Some whispered prayers of thanks. Others clapped softly, unsure if celebration was allowed but compelled to release emotion. Tears streaked faces that had been pale with fear hours before. The captain exhaled, voice rough. We're down. All of us. The first officer let out a laugh, a low, incredulous sound. I can't believe it. Passenger 89 remained seated, headset still on, her hands steady on her lap. She allowed herself the faintest smile, eyes reflecting relief but also exhaustion. Her work was done, though the adrenaline still hummed in her veins. She had guided the aircraft, maintained order, commanded respect, and saved hundreds without fanfare, without claim. Outside, the A-10s returned once more, banking in formation. Overhead, a subtle, synchronized maneuver, a salute, an acknowledgement of respect from combat pilots to a civilian who had held her nerve in impossible circumstances. It was unspoken, yet absolute. The jets peeled away slowly, leaving the sky clear, guardianship transferred to the ground crews and the pilots who had carried the aircraft safely. The passengers erupted into muted applause, some crying openly. Flight attendants allowed themselves the same release, faces streaked with tears and relief. The city of Denver sparkled beyond the tarmac, indifferent yet welcoming, a stage for survival and human courage. The captain leaned toward passenger 89, voice low but filled with awe. "I don't even know what to say. You saved us." She shook her head softly. "We all did. I just spoke for what needed to be said." The first officer nodded. "In agreement. Your voice carried more weight than anyone could imagine. Those pilots, they trusted you." She offered a small, humble smile. "I just kept it steady. That's all." Outside, emergency crews began to approach, walking carefully around the plane, ready for inspection and assistance, though nothing was required. The aircraft had landed safely, and the hundreds aboard were unharmed. The reality of that moment, the full breadth of what had just occurred, began to settle. Some passengers moved to the windows, waving at the dissipating A-10s. Others whispered thanks to unseen guardians above. The child who had slept fitfully hours before now pressed a small hand against the window, eyes wide as if seeing heroes. For the first time, passenger 89 finally removed her headset. The cockpit fell into quiet, the first true silence in hours. She leaned back slightly, letting her body relax for the first time, allowing the exhaustion to creep in. Hours of tension, fear, and precision hung in her muscles, but relief softened the edges. The captain reached over, shaking her hand briefly. "You'll always be a legend in this cockpit." She smiled faintly. "Only if the story is told." "Right." The first officer laughed softly. "Oh, it will be. Believe me. Everyone aboard will remember this day. And those pilots, too, they won't forget." Outside, the Denver night settled over the runway. The A-10s had vanished beyond the horizon, guardians returning to their bases. The city remained unaware of the drama it had sheltered in silence, except for the hundreds who now knew what it meant to survive against impossible odds. Passenger 89 finally allowed herself a moment to breathe fully. Hundreds of lives safe, tension unspooling, respect earned, fear transformed into gratitude. She had been passenger 89, anonymous and unassuming, until her voice became the tether between life and disaster. And in that silence of the night, amidst claps, tears, and whispered thanks, her quiet heroism was recognized not in headlines, not in ceremonies, but in the deepest, most human way, the acknowledgement of every life she had touched, protected, and saved. And as she sat there, in the stillness of the cockpit after the storm, she allowed herself a smile that was not about pride, but about relief. The passengers would leave the aircraft, the pilots would debrief, the fighters would return to basebut. The moment of courage, a voice commanding respect in the face of fear, would linger forever. The city lights of Denver stretched before them, calm and indifferent. And in that calm, passenger 89 understood what it meant to carry the weight of hundreds, to speak with authority born of necessity, to remain steady when all else trembled. Her voice had saved lives. Her presence had ensured survival. And the salute of steel wings above would mark her story forever.